Hello, I'm here to rank all 133 books that I read this year. I'm very nervous for this because I feel like it's going to take a really long time. There might be like an outfit and lighting change halfway through this because if I'm tired of this, I'm just going to stop. I'm not going to be fun if I'm over it. So maybe we're not going to make it all the way through tonight. This is 18% of what I read this year. So that's cool. I read a lot of library books. Before I get into telling you about this tier list, I just wanted to talk about something really quick. I promise I'll be so quick about this. I'm not going to like bang you over the head with it. I am starting a Patreon book club. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to bite the bullet. I'm doing it. Starting in January, we are reading Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and I'm so fucking excited about it. If you want to join, please do. It's going to be really fun, I promise. I don't want to sit here and like convince you to join. I want you to join because you want to. If you're watching this video and you think that we have similar taste, just come over to the Patreon and let's have a little book club. There'll be like some discussion forums and then a couple of videos that I'll make throughout the month and then one big long one at the end of the month. I'm really excited about it. I'm going to shut up now. I'm sorry. I think everything is in order. I think that this is going to work. I think the screen recording is going. I am technically incapable, so let's just really hope that this all goes really smoothly. I'm just going to start. Here is my tier list, okay? This is not like 100% perfect of a gradient. There's some things like in the top two categories that I like the one in the lower category better. These are just categories that I thought I could fit every single book into. It's not like exactly like worst to best kind of thing. So the top is Everyone Read This Now. This is books that I love and that I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to anyone. Below that is Exactly What I Wanted. These are books that are my taste that I just like fucking loved, but that maybe I wouldn't tell every single person on the planet to read. There's maybe some more genre fiction in here, some weirder stuff that I would hesitate to recommend to everyone. Under that, we have the category that probably almost everything is going to fall into, which is pretty good, but there's some issues. And I'll let you know what I liked about these books and what the issues were. Then we have Forgettable. I read 133 books this year. I'm going to forget some of them, maybe lots of them. So that's going to also probably be a pretty big category. Under that, we have Disappointed Me. These are books, kind of it's my fault that they're in this category because I went in with such high expectations or just like even just medium expectations and they were terrible. At the very bottom, we have books that I wish I could forget. There's a few in here that I've talked about before. I think some that I haven't. The first book that I started the year off with is going right into that category, and that was Fantasticland by Mike Bachman. And I would like to justify why I read this book because I'm embarrassed that it's even on the list, and especially embarrassed that I started the year off with it. When I read a really, really good book, like a favorite book of all time kind of book, that puts me into a reading slump. And so I had just read This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, which I've talked about ad nauseum. It's one of my favorite books of all time. So fantastic, and I could not pick up anything else because nothing was going to be This Thing Between Us. So I picked up Fantasticland because it's like a ridiculous horror book about kids who are stuck at an amusement park after a hurricane, and they like break off into these gangs and then start just like absolutely murdering each other. It's like really gory, it's ridiculous, it's over the top, super fast paced because it has like not a entirely linear narrative. It's like told through interviews. I also found it used, so I owned it, so I didn't have to like go and pick something up at the library that I maybe wasn't going to read. This was horrible. This was such a bad book. I've heard that the audiobook version is okay, but when you're reading it as a book, it's just garbage. I have read another Mike Bachman book since, which we'll talk about, and was worse than this. And I think that he just has like a kind of gore fetish, and I don't want to read about it. He's a bad writer. He did this thing where he tried to differentiate the voices in the interviews, but it was so obvious that he was not skilled enough to do that. I can't explain how. He just like made each voice so distinct in such an over-the-top way that it actually just emphasized how similar every voice was. So this was horrible and I hated it, and I'm embarrassed to have ever read it. After that, I read What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. This is going into Forgettable. I don't remember this book much at all. This is another book that I own. I found it used again, I think at the same time as Fantasticland. It's about a woman and her friend is dying from cancer and asks her to help the friend end her life. This is told kind of through the narrator's interactions with a whole bunch of different people, which I think is an interesting way to write a book. And I think Nunez does it well. There's just like not a whole lot here for me to like grasp onto. This is definitely at the top of the forgettable category. I think that it's super well written, and I have bought another used book by the same author because I think she is a really good writer. After a year there's not much that stands out to me from this book. After that, I read this tiny novella, The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark, and I'm going to put that into pretty good, but there's issues. I feel like I did not get this book as much as I wanted to. It was a crazy ride, for sure. I think that I would definitely benefit from rereading this, and I would recommend it somewhat. It's translated, I want to say, from German, but I've actually just made that up. It doesn't say. It's definitely translated, though. Oh my god, it's not translated at all. Wow, that's really interesting. I think this was originally written in English by a Scottish woman, so that's fascinating. It reads as super translated, but I think in a way that's deliberate. The characters in this are very weird and almost like inhuman in the way that they interact with each other. The dialogue is super interesting. Like, people are always having two separate conversations with each other. Like, one person is talking about one thing and the other person is talking about another thing. It's not like a misunderstanding kind of thing. It's just that's how she does dialogue. Wow, okay, I actually really have to reread that knowing that it was originally in English. That's fascinating. This book follows a woman and she's on a journey to do something. There's like a climax at the end that you know is coming, but you don't really know how. But really, more than how, the main question in this book is why. And I'm not going to tell you that you get a satisfying answer to that. The next book on this list is The Body in Question by Jill Cement. And I'm going to put that into forgettable because I actually could not tell you one thing about it. I picked this up off the shelf at the library, which is not something that I often do with books. It doesn't always go super well for me. This book said that it was about like a trial. And there's these two jurors and they fall in love. And then it gets to like the jury deliberation part of the trial. And they realize that they both think completely different things about the guilt of the person on trial. I thought it was going to be more about like the criminal legal system and the way that this trial played out. The trial follows this like teenage girl who is accused of killing her baby brother in a house fire. Fascinating. It was not about that. It was about like romance and sex. And in it, okay, in the book, they like have sex. They're not supposed to like talk to each other at all. So it's like all this like secret hidden thing. I didn't ever think of it as romantic though, but in the book they're having sex and then afterwards he just like stays in there for like a long time. I thought it was so weird. I'm not putting that in the video. That's not going on my YouTube channel forever. This book meant nothing to me. I will truly never think about it again. Up next is Crying in hmar, and I'm putting that into disappointed me. I'm sorry. This was one of my first experiences reading a popular book and kind of coming to the conclusion that popular books are not popular because they're necessarily like really good. It's more because they are accessible to a wide range of people, including people who don't read a lot, and that's where I think Crying in hmar fell into. I'm kind of just echoing here what I saw another creator on YouTube who I love, Charles, say about this book, which is that like everybody dies, you're not special, and if you're gonna write a book about death, like a memoir about death, you have to have something unique to say, and she just didn't. It starts off okay. I like the concept of like going through the grieving process with food, but then it just became like repetitive and taxing. Like, okay, we're just listing foods now. I don't really care. This certainly isn't like a terrible book, and I think there are things that I enjoyed it exploring, like her selfishness in her mother's death. I think that she was not afraid to be very vulnerable and to not look awesome all of the time, which I think was great. It was like fine. For everything I had seen about it and all the people I had seen talking about it, I thought it was going to be a lot better than it was. Okay, now we have Fish Swimming in Dappled Sunlight, which I'm going to put into Wish I Could Forget, because that book was fucking bullshit and it irritated the fuck out of me. Oh my god, okay. This is about two people and they're like in love, and then they learn that they're brother and sister, and then they have a night together where they just like hash out all of the beef between them. There's this huge tension between them because they together had found out they were brother and sister, and they found their father who had abandoned them both as children. Obviously they have different mothers. They found him and he's like a hiking guide, so they go on a hike up this mountain with him, and then he falls from a cliff, and they both think that the other one has killed him. The problem with this book, and maybe this was a translation issue, it definitely wasn't a great translation. The problem with it is that these two people have these like crazy speculations with absolutely no backing behind it that just become true in the book. I hated that. They would just say something and you'd be like, okay, they have literally no reason to think that, and then it was true. And that happened over and over and over again. It was a small read, but I was honestly annoyed throughout the entire thing. After that, we have Ripe by Sarah Rose Etter, and I am really questioning where to put this because I think when I finished this book, I would have put it in the disappointment category, but after sitting with it, I actually like honestly think about it a lot, and I feel like it's probably up there with like pretty good, but there's issues. When I finished this book, I was like, okay, whatever, a really on the nose metaphor for depression. This is about a woman and she has a black hole that follows her around everywhere. She's working in tech in San Francisco, I think. I think at the time of reading this, I was starting to understand that I was really into magical realism, and I don't think that this did that genre well. Like I said, it's super, super on the nose, like shoved in your face. There's a black hole following her around. She's depressed. Okay? But then, after a while, I realized that I was holding my breath through this entire book. It was so tense, and I think that Sarah Rose Etter does a really good job of making you feel the way this woman feels as her life just like slowly and quietly crumbles around her. Like nothing big, huge, like crazy happens to her, but all these little things like just build up and just destroy her. Like even just like her work says that she has to go to this like conference or workshop thing every Saturday, or even just every other Saturday for like a couple of months, and you're like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. She's just destroyed by living in a capitalist society. What I hated the most about this book though is that it doesn't like do a great job with the commentary. It's like very much about the hellscape of capitalism, and also about like a white woman who's like really privileged and like fine, like she's doing fine, and then she tries to make this like class commentary that just falls super flat. The class commentary is literally like, oh my god, there's a homeless person here and I have a home. That's crazy. I was annoyed by that part, but other parts of it I have thought about a lot. The building of tension was great. I'm pretty sure I've been kicking the camera like maybe even this whole time, so if it's been shaking, I'm so sorry. After that, I read one of the only nonfiction books I read this year, which is The Care Manifesto by the Care Collective. This putting right into forgettable because it was fine. Sometimes I would be able to quote things from this book in like an essay and feel really smart, feeling like the professor had thought that I had read an entire book just for the essay, but I'd actually already read it. That feels good. I don't really think about anything that I read in this book. I think it was an interesting little read. I love a short nonfiction book. It kind of got repetitive. I've read many more books about like activism and protesting that were a lot better written than this. Then we have a short story collection, Lost Animal Club, that is also going straight into forgettable. I think that this book is supposed to talk about like the beastly qualities that humans can have, but it didn't feel coherent and like it stayed on theme. And again, I remember nothing from this. Not a single story stuck in my mind. Then we have Several People Are Typing, which is a book I realize I have never been able to talk about on here. There's just not been a thing that came up. This is going right into exactly what I wanted because this is perfect. I thought it was going to be so gimmicky because this is a book told entirely through Slack messages. If you're 12, Slack is like Discord, but for work. This is about a guy who gets sucked into his Slack messaging and like leaves his body. He is stuck in the Slack, and everyone is like, no, you're not. Like, just come to work. This is some ridiculous thing that you're doing. Like, it's okay if you're sick. You can just be sick, but it seems like you're just avoiding work. And he's like, guys, I'm stuck in here. Please get me out. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds gimmicky. It is so well done. At times, this book was like beautiful and heartfelt, and it's also so funny. I felt like it matched up with my sense of humor very well, but not in a way that felt like super specific to a time and place, even though it is kind of that because it's told through Slack messages, like very internet-y. Each of the co-workers in this book had such a unique voice, which is such a feat when you're only telling the story through the messages that they send. Like, you would never really get mixed up with who was who. After just like a few pages, it was very clear who everyone was and what they were like. There is shit in here that is done so well. There are twists and turns that you're like, oh my fucking god. You go back, flip through the book, it all tracks, but you don't notice while it's happening. I don't want to spoil it because I think you should go read it, but I also think a lot of people are going to hate this book because it is truly a gimmick. It's just a gimmick done so well and so creatively. I have honestly nothing but good things to say about Several People Are Typing. Next book is Everything You Ever Wanted, which I'm putting into disappointment. I was so mad at this book. I thought that this was such a great concept, and it was executed horribly. Everything You Ever Wanted is about a depressed woman who decides to go on this trip to live on another planet, and she can never return back to Earth. They don't really live on the planet because it's not inhabitable by humans. They live on this like large compound that has been built on this planet. At the time, I was obsessed with the concept of like missing life on Earth, and I wanted that to be done so much better. Like, I feel like the author never put herself in the head of someone who had left Earth and like loved it now that she had gone. I just felt like she would talk about the most basic things that she missed about Earth. Like, oh, I miss the wind. I miss how the sun feels. Like, I wanted like minutia of a daily life that she missed. Like, I wanted her to miss washing the fucking dishes or something. Even that is pretty basic. I truly felt like the author did not get inside the head of what this character would actually feel like, and it was really shallow because of that. Though I love the concept of like depressed and suicidal woman tries to die many times on Earth, then she leaves Earth and all of a sudden like she refuses to die and she's the only one there who wants to live. It just could have been so much more, and I was so sad that it wasn't. Next, we have Penance by Eliza Clark, putting that into exactly what I wanted. This was a great book. I love commentary on true crime. Fuck true crime. Fuck the true crime community. I hate you all. Get a grip, get a life, get a sense of empathy. I'm going way too hard into that. I'm going to back off a little bit. Penance follows this journalist trying to uncover what happened when a group of teenage girls like brutally murdered one of their friends. It gets really deep into the dynamics and the history between these girls. This is not told in like a really linear way. It's like interviews and what this journalist has found, and he is an incredibly unreliable narrator, and you don't know that necessarily through the entire book. You can sense that he's kind of a shit guy from the beginning, but I think that the lies he tells throughout this book really come out at the end and are kind of like shocking to discover. I loved the way that this got into the ethics of true crime and who is telling true crime stories and how well they're doing it or how truthfully they're doing it. It was really well executed. After that, I read The Third Hotel by Laura Vandenberg, something like that. I can't see the names on this thing. They're all little squares, so please forgive me. This, I'm going to pop into forgettable. No, I'm going to put it into pretty good, but there's issues. I think it's just been a long time since I probably read this in February. I don't 100% know what happens in it, but I liked it. I think that it was not what I was expecting it to be, but then I still enjoyed it nonetheless. This is about a woman whose husband dies, and then she goes to Cuba, and she sees him there, like wearing an outfit she's never seen him in that's obviously tailored to the Cuban sun, and she follows him around. I thought it was going to be a little bit more weird or like a little bit more ghostly, when really it's mostly just an exploration of grief, but I think it's a well done exploration of grief. I just think I thought that it was something that it wasn't. Up next, we have Gunk Baby, which I'm throwing right into Wish I Could Forget. It more than disappointed me. I was pissed off at this book. Gunk Baby is supposed to be this like anti-capitalist story following a woman who opens up an ear cleaning business in a mall. It's not that, because it felt like the author like really did not know how to execute her points here. Like, she had something she was trying to say and she didn't know how to say it, and she didn't really know that much about it. It just felt so randomly cobbled together. I felt over the whole book like at one point it was gonna get better. I just pushed myself through it. I was like, this is gonna make sense, and then it never did. It also had a really strange writing style that was not fun. It was just tedious to read. I didn't understand what was happening. I think that really comes down to Lau's writing style. I just found her word choice and her sentence structure so absurd and unreadable, and not in a fun way. I like a weird book. This was not weird. It was just trying to be weird, not doing well with it, and then giving me characters that I didn't care about or connect to or empathize with, and also didn't hate. Like, I just felt so indifferent towards these characters, and I also felt indifferent towards the plot. It was not remotely engaging. I had to force myself to read it. I wanted it to be so much more than it was. It could have been good. The next book is Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan, and that is going into Everyone Read This Now. I think this was just a really good book. It's just classic literary fiction. Everyone will get something from it. Everyone will feel something about it. It's just a good book. It takes place in 2 different timelines. So it begins with this group of like rowdy teenage boys, and they're traveling from Scotland to London to go to this concert. It's really just an exploration of their dynamics and their friendship, particularly centering around one of the boys who's kind of like the leader of the gang, and this kid that everybody fucking loves. The second half of the book follows the narrator, James, and this kid everyone loves, Tully, as Tully is dying from cancer, and James is helping him die. This book was super atmospheric. I think that the setting was beautifully written and so like immersive. The dialogue was funny and it flowed well. The characters were charismatic and immediately likable, and I wanted to know what happened to them, and I loved being with them on this journey. and it was sad as fuck. Okay, now I'm coming at you with a controversial opinion, and that is me putting Motherthing into disappointed me. I almost want to put it one lower, but I'm not going to because it is really summed up by this was such a disappointment. So Motherthing is a story about a woman who is haunted by her mother-in-law who dies. The problem with this book is that it would have been great. It would have been a fantastic read. I thought that the characterization was so interesting. It was so fucking like evocative and visceral, but the way it represented borderline personality disorder as this thing that just like makes you a shitty person was so stereotypical and so harmful. I felt really, really frustrated the entire time. The mother-in-law, the woman with BPD, is portrayed as this irredeemable, awful person, and it's because of her diagnosis. And I thought that was a really shitty thing for Ainsley Hogarth to do. Like, there just doesn't need to be more of that sentiment out there. It's not true, and it's a shitty thing to say. It's a shitty thing to write into a book, and I hated it. And that meant that everything that I thought was really great about this book just honestly ended up leaving a bad taste in my mouth because I don't like the author. Like, women can be bad people without having BPD. Get fucking real. Next up, we have One's Company by Ashley Hutton, which I desperately want to put into everyone read this now, but I know it's not for everyone. It definitely was for me, and so it's going into the second category, but like, God, it's a little bit better than the other ones that are in there. One's Company is about an absurd, weird woman with an insanely traumatic past who wins the lottery and uses that money to build a perfect replica of her favorite TV show's set. So much is packed into this little book, and at the same time, it's still so detail focused, especially with like her getting the set perfectly right and then enacting each episode exactly as it was. I loved reading about this woman. She was so weird. Her worldview was so weird, but also understandable. At times you're like, I totally get her, and then other times you're like, oh my god, what a fucking maniac. It was awesome. I both loved and hated her. I loved and hated all of the characters in this. It made me feel so many things, and it just explored everything that it tried to perfectly. This book is hugely underrated, and if it sounds interesting to you at all, I think you should go read it. It was so good. Then we have Hurricane Girl by Marcy Dermansky, I think, and I'm going to put that into everyone read this now, even though I don't know if that's the right choice. It was just so good. Oh my god, it was so good. This is about a woman who experiences a shocking act of violence that leaves her with a traumatic brain injury, and the book follows her recovering from this injury. There is a cathartic ending that I'm not going to spoil, but god, it's so good. But more than anything, what really stands out in this book is the voice of this character with a brain injury. I think that Dermansky does such a good job with it. She becomes like so driven by logic. She'll feel an emotion and then she'll logic her way out of that emotion. It's fascinating. It is a little bit hard to read because of the brain injury. The dialogue is super, super weird. Like, nobody uses contractions, which makes it very stilted, but in a way that's deliberate. So it does make it harder to read, but there's a point for it, so it doesn't make the book worse. I think the stilted dialogue did make it kind of hard to connect with the characters, but I didn't find that connection necessary for me to be invested in the story. I read this in one sitting and I enjoyed it the whole way through. Then we have Pizza Girl, which I'm going to put into exactly what I wanted. This is another great book, and I thought it was funny that I read a book named Hurricane Girl and then immediately read a book named Pizza Girl. Pizza Girl is about a teenager. I think she's like 18, and she is like 8 months pregnant, and she becomes obsessed with this woman that orders a pizza at the pizza place that she works at. Nothing really happens in this book, but it remains totally engaging throughout because it's a book about obsession, and I fucking love books about obsession. This does it great. It was really easy to connect with the main character and empathize with her, even when she does selfish things and hurts the people that she loves. Like, even when you're frustrated with her, you still want to know what's happening in the story, and you still, at the end of the day, you like her. I thought this did a fantastic job exploring the complexities of grieving a parent who wasn't very good to you. I think that it is really realistic in the way it portrays the relationship dynamics between the characters and the mental illness of the main character, and it's all done with this beautiful prose. I loved this book. Maybe I'm going to put it up one. I'm putting it up one. I'm sorry. Okay, now we have another book that I feel like I have to justify why I read it, but I actually can't. This was such a stupid choice because this book was awful, and it was also everything it said it was going to be. That was The Laws of the Skies by some guy with a French name. Putting that into Wish I Could Forget. Okay, this book... It's so embarrassing to tell you what it's about because it's like, actually, why did I read this? This is about a group of like 6-year-olds who go on a class trip camping, and then they just slowly start dying. Everybody dies at the end. Nobody comes back. It says that on the back of the book. I'm not spoiling it for you, but also, like, you don't need to go read this. That's all it is. There's truly nothing more to it than this guy explaining in kind of gruesome detail, but not even that gruesome, how a bunch of children die. And it's so fucking unrealistic. This dude has never spoken to a child in his life. The way he writes, just like the way they think, it is so obvious to you that like the last time this guy thought about being 6 years old was when he was 6 years old, and he doesn't remember it at all. This dude also doesn't know that like kids bounce. There are two, I think, children in this story who died just from like falling over and breaking their necks. That doesn't really happen, especially not twice in one story. Like, kids run and fall all the fucking time, and they bounce back up. They're springy. This book did not know that. It was unrealistic, and it was ridiculous, and I hated it, but also, like, I can't really complain about it because it was everything it said it was going to be, which is awful. Okay, next up we have Big Swiss by Jen Began. I'm putting that right at the top. I think everyone would like this book. And I know that's not true because lots of people really don't like this book. I loved this book. This is about a woman named Greta, and she transcribes sex therapy sessions, and she becomes obsessed with this woman whose voice she keeps hearing at these sessions, who she nicknames Big Swiss. And then she meets her in person because this is like a relatively small town, and they enter into this relationship with this crazy power dynamic because Greta it does not let on that she transcribes these therapy sessions, so she knows way more about Big Swiss than Big Swiss knows about her. This is another story about obsession and weird characters, and it's so eccentric and like over the top, but just in the perfect way. It's got a humor to it. It's super fast paced. Like, I remember not being able to put this book down at all. It is quite erotic, but not like overly sexual, and I'm obsessed with it. All right, next book is The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. I don't really know where to put this. I kind of think it's in... No, I'm going to put it in pretty good, but there's issues. This book had a good concept that was not executed perfectly, but it was nowhere near as disappointing as any of the books in the other category. This is about a woman who gets her daughter taken away from her after just a really shitty day where she makes a lot of mistakes, and she is sent to this school that is meant to teach her how to be a good mother. And it really does get into like the politics of that, the class, race, power dynamics of that whole thing, and I think it does a good job of that. The problem with this book is that it can be quite slow and quite repetitive in the middle. But what's really strong about this book is the crazy sense of injustice that it creates. Like, it's just not fair. And just over and over and over again, it's not fucking fair, and it frustrates you endlessly. Like, you feel heartbroken for this woman, and the stakes are so high because she's trying to get her daughter back, and there are things that she has to do at this school to get her daughter back that they have set her up to fail on. I touched on it briefly, but what I would have loved to see explored more in this book is how this School for Good Mothers teaches one very specific way of parenting, and it teaches it to women who are largely like racialized and marginalized, and it teaches them like this very, very North American centric way of parenting and how there would be a lot more clash there. I thought that aspect was like ripe for interrogation, but that the author got too much into like the details of exactly what they were doing at this school for it to really have space to get super deep into other stuff. Okay, now we have I'd Really Prefer Not to Be Here With You by somebody whose last name, if I say it, I swear to God, I'm going to get kicked off of this fucking platform. So I'm just going to put that right into Disappointed Me. It sounded like a series of short stories that I really would have liked, and I think that it was poorly edited and poorly written and just poorly thought up. I think that magical realism is a great genre for short stories, and this was that. And I think that her ideas were really just like an idea, like a sentence that she had in her head, and then she fleshed it out into a story, but she wasn't saying anything or doing anything. It just wasn't good. There's really nothing good about any of the stories. I felt like through each one I could see a very clear lack of writing skill. Now we have The Need by Helen Phillips, which I'm gonna put into exactly what I wanted. I think I really liked this book. This is a horror book, and it is such a horror book in the beginning. Like, actually, I felt like I was gonna fucking die. My heart was racing reading this book. It starts with this mother, and she's in her house. Her husband has gone off on a trip, and while she's there, she sees someone in her house, but she thinks, no, I've just made it up in my mind. She doesn't let on to the kids. They're very young. She doesn't let on to them that she thinks something's happening. And then she convinces herself that she's just made it up, but someone is in her house. Part of the story also follows her work as like an archaeologist at this dig site that keeps coming up with things that are just a little bit wrong, like a Coke bottle with an upside down font on it that had never been produced, or a Bible that refers to Jesus as she the entire time. It's unsettling, it's creepy, there's twists and turns, it gets a little bit sci-fi, so if you really, really hate that, maybe don't read it, but I thought that this was a fantastic and terrifying exploration of motherhood and like it's called The Need. Like, what children just constantly suck from you and need from you. Well, that sounds like I'm talking about breast milk. Another thing that I think Helen Phillips does really, really well with this book is she knows what children are like. Like, I think that she must be a mom or work with children because she writes their dialogue perfectly. She just understands how they talk, and I think that that can be really hard to convey in a book, and I don't think I've ever read a book that does it as well as this. Okay, next up we have Shark Heart, which is a book I haven't had an opportunity to complain about, but I fucking hated this book and everybody loved it. I'm putting it into disappointed me, but I kind of want to put it one down into wish I could forget because it was awful. Shark Heart is about a woman whose husband turns into a great white shark. That sounds awesome. I love weird fiction. I love magical realism. I thought that this was going to be a book that I was going to adore, and it was just done so poorly. I hated the author's writing style. It felt to me like I was reading some Rupi Kaur poems on Tumblr in 2012. She would make these absolutely random choices trying to be deep or strange. Like, the chapters are super short, often just like a couple of sentences, and it felt arbitrary where she would cut them off, and it also felt like she was trying to make it not arbitrary, but then it just was. The weird formatting choices were distracting and they added nothing to the book. The characters were so underdeveloped and I could not care less about them when this is in a lot of ways supposed to be like almost a romance or like a character study. It just doesn't do it well. It does nothing that it tries to do well. It all just fell flat for me. I understand the turning into a great white shark as an allegory for cancer or dementia, but I think that it just did nothing with what was an idea that had boundless potential. This book broke my heart because I am so in love with the concept of it, and I hated the actual execution. I just really wish someone else had written Shark Heart. Next up, we have Liar, Dreamer, Thief, which I'm going to put into forgettable because I don't know anything that happened in that book. I think it's about a woman who's obsessed with her coworker, and then he one night jumps off a bridge and he like accuses her of being at fault for it, and a whole bunch of crazy stuff happens, but it's not that interesting or well conceived. If you want a book that like gives you a whole bunch of little hints to what the ending is going to be and then kind of pieces it all together, it does a pretty good job of that. It's not great though. It's too long. It should have been a lot shorter. After that, we have Animal by Lisa Taddeo, which I think I'm also going to put into forgettable. Maybe this was just a period of reading that I was not really conscious for. I don't really remember anything that happens in this book. Wow, so yeah, I have nothing to say about that. I don't remember it being bad. I think that maybe if I read it at a different time, it would have a higher rating. I don't think that it would go lower than this, but like it did not stick in my brain at all. Next, we have Yellowface, which I think no one is going to be surprised I'm going to stick into disappointed me. It was not that good. This is another case of just because it's popular doesn't mean it's good. It just means it's accessible, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I thought it was going to be a different thing. Yellowface was easy to read, quickly paced, and it held my interest throughout. I liked the examination of the publishing industry. I thought that was an interesting deep dive. I just think that there was so much room for commentary that this book just did not really get into. I think I can't really say it better than Read with Cindy, whose video I will try to link if I remember. I'm so sorry if I don't, but I'm sure you can find it. I think it just missed out on a lot of commentary that it set itself up to do, and when it did try to get into that commentary, it was really, really heavy-handed with it. It was a lot more interesting when we explored the narrator's racism through the like insidious, more hidden aspects of it, like in the choices that she made while rewriting the book, than it was with her like overt sweeping generalizations that she would be like, I know this is racist, but I just felt like I was being beaten over the head with it, and then it wasn't even really saying anything that it was beating me over the head with. And there's a class component here that is super missing from the fucking story, and I think Cindy gets into that because I'm pretty sure that the author grew up rich as fuck, and that's why she didn't really get into what the beginning sets out to be in a very important piece of what happens. I do understand why Yellowface is popular, and I think that it deserves that popularity. I just wanted like a lot more from it. Next up, we have The Guest by Emma Cline, which I'm going to put into pretty good, but there's some issues. This is about a woman who breaks up with her rich boyfriend, and she spends the next few days before this party that he's throwing that she wants to make amends with him at, floating around Long Island and using her youth and beauty to manipulate men into letting her like sleep on their couches. She just keeps like messing it up, and then it's fine, and then she messes it up, and then it's fine. So there's this tension throughout where you're like, I know she's gonna make the wrong move and get kicked out and then start wandering around trying to find a new place to stay. The stakes really aren't that high. I'm sure you can tell by the way I'm describing it, but they feel really high while you're reading this. I love Klein's writing style. The thing that I hated about this book was the fucking ending. What a horrible, stupid ending. I'm sorry. I wish that she had just done something else. It felt lazy. She just stopped writing, and then that was it. But I also can see that that has kept me thinking about this book for far longer than a different ending would have. But that's mostly because I'm frustrated, so I don't really know what to say about that. Next up, we have Death in Her Hands by Tessa Moshfegh. This was my first Moshfegh, and it disappointed me. I liked the concept, and I kind of liked the writing. I was really distracted by the incredibly visceral, repetitive, and useless fat phobia in this book. Call me a snowflake all you fucking want. I thought that it was distracting. I thought it was stupid. And I thought that it felt like just Otesha Moshfegh's own opinion on fat people being inserted into this character and doing nothing to like tell us anything about the character. She's so boring about it. She's so boring about hating fat people. And it made me not really want to read anything else in her work. Death in Her Hands has a great concept of this older woman whose husband has died, and so she moves into this cabin, and she becomes obsessed after finding a note that says her name was, I don't know, like Matilda or something. This is her dead body. I didn't kill her. Something like that. I'm absolutely paraphrasing. I don't remember. But she becomes obsessed with creating the story of what happened to this girl. There's no body, by the way. She just finds the note. She creates this story, and then she meets people in the town. Like, it's absolutely just pulled out of her ass. But then she meets people in the town, and it all matches up with this story that she's created. And you really don't know, like, what to believe and what is reality and what she's just created in her mind. Very interesting concept. I honestly, like, it was so rampant in this book. It was not just like one or two little sentences. She just kept doing it, and every time I was like, oh my god, here we go talking about fat people again. Jesus fucking Christ. That's hugely what I remember from the book. Next up, we have Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies, which I'm gonna pop into forgettable. I think there are people out there who will think this is the best book ever written. It's not really my taste, but I understand why someone might like it. This is about a mother, and she has cancer, and part of the story is told through cancer's perspective. This plays around with form and format a lot, and it was fun. It just, like, I think at the time it wasn't the book that I wanted to be reading, so I didn't care for it all that much. And at times it felt like this was trying to like wring emotion out of me, and it just wasn't quite working for me. There were times when the playing with the format and the point of view were just perfectly done and striking and like shocking. I felt like this was way too long of a book, and it dragged on and on for like 300 pages, and then it got really interesting, but at that point it was like, I've read 300 pages to get to the good part. That does not feel worth it. The writing was beautiful, and I also really liked how this book put a lot of trust into the reader. It didn't over explain things to you. You kind of had to like piece things together yourself. I thought that was great. It just didn't really stick in my mind. All right, I took a little break. I made myself a giant mug of tea, and we're going to get through this. Okay, the next book on the list is Concerning My Daughter, which I think... Oh, I don't know where to put this. I think I'm going to put it into pretty good, but there's issues. Because I want to put it at the top. Like, everyone should read this book. I certainly don't think it's exactly what I like, because it is like pure literary fiction. Nothing really weird about it. But it's very, very, very well done. And it's hard for me to think of any issues with it. I think I am going to put it at the top. Okay, Concerning My Daughter. This is following the perspective of an older woman whose daughter, who's like a young adult, is gay. And she doesn't like this. She's very homophobic. This book was written by the author trying to understand her conservative mother's perspective. I think that this does a very good job of exploring a woman who's very easy to write off as just a hateful bigot. I think it doesn't sugarcoat or excuse her actions or her behaviors, but it does allow you to empathize with her in a way that you probably likely wouldn't have. It was generous and kind without excusing like shitty bigoted behavior, and I thought that that was very unique to this book. I think the ending was great. It didn't cheapen the story, and it felt realistic. It wasn't like totally like cathartic. She changes her mind completely. She becomes a new person that would have like destroyed everything that the rest of the book was. It just made a lot of sense the way that it ended. This is a great concept, and it was translated absolutely beautifully. I would have liked to know a little bit more about the daughter's character, but I understand why we didn't, considering that this is a book written by that daughter. Next up, we have The Woman in the Purple Skirt. I'm putting this one into pretty good, but there's some issues. This is a very small, fast-paced little book. It's super easy to read. It's another book about obsession. There's this woman, and she's obsessed with the woman in the purple skirt. She kind of like manipulates her life from the outside. They don't know each other. They're just neighbors. And she gets this woman in the purple skirt to come and work at her job so that she can like keep a closer eye on her. Finally, at the end, No, I'm not going to tell you. But like, it all leads up to something very big that's very exciting. I thought it built a lot of tension and it left a lot of trust to me as the reader to intuit what was happening, especially because you don't know when you can rely on this crazed narrator's interpretations of reality. It's translated, I believe, from Japanese, and it's an okay translation. I often find translations from Japanese not that great. The dialogue is very stilted. I don't think that's really the translator's fault. I think it's the difference between the two languages. The prose can just be quite dull. I think that this does what a lot of other Japanese literature I've read does very well, which is explore its themes beautifully and like so in depth. I loved the theme of like being seen or unseen, and how when the narrator is finally looked at, it's so striking because you realize that it's been this thing that you've been like anxiously waiting for but not really realizing that you were waiting for. Overall, it was good. I don't think I would necessarily recommend it. The next book I would recommend, and I'm putting it right at the top, and that is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is genre fiction. This is straight science fiction, so you know this is good. I saw Jacob Geller recommend this, and obviously I trust his taste, even though we don't really have the same taste in anything. I think that he's really intelligent, and I wanted to know what he was talking about when he talked about really enjoying this book. It's perfect. I don't know how to describe exactly what is so good about this. It's so philosophical on themes of what it means to be human and like consciousness. A lot of science fiction explores that. None of it does it as well as Exhalation. It's so thoughtful. Each and every story left me with so much to think about. There's also author's notes at the end, so you finish one story and then you can go and read about like how he came up with the concept, what he was thinking about when he was writing it. It is very sciencey, mostly in the author's notes section, and I think that's just such an interesting way to gain more insight into his writing process. Even stories that were in settings that wouldn't normally interest me, again, I'm not really a science fiction reader, held my interest throughout. It was so good, particularly the first story, the time travel one, and the creationism story. Oh my god. If the creationism story is posted somewhere, I'm going to find it and I'm going to link it. It is so fucking good. Wow. It made me feel so much. It made me think so much. This was just a perfect collection. And for short stories, that's crazy. I loved every one of them. Next up, we have A Minor Chorus by Billy Ray Belcourt, and I'm also going to put that into Everyone Should Read This Now. This book is pure literary fiction, so I think it's pretty easy to read for a wide audience, and it is one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read in my life. The way Belcourt handles and transforms the English language is like nothing I've ever read before. Nothing really happens in this book. It's kind of just about a guy who's writing a book about his hometown. It's about queerness and indigenous identity, but it's also just about like being a writer and about like writing for a community or as a community. It made me want to write. It made me want to be a better writer. And even though nothing happens, the writing is so captivating that you will want to read it and want to like savor it. It's so delicious. If he can make a book that is so plotless, which is not something I typically like, so good, so interesting, I think I would honestly read anything that he writes. I absolutely love Belcourt as an author. There's no one who makes sentences the same way that he does. The next book is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and I'm gonna put that into exactly what I wanted. This was just like such a fun little book. I love Murata. This, like truly all of her work, I've read everything that's been translated into English of hers so far, is about a woman who doesn't fit in with society, and it's really a critique of patriarchal, misogynistic society and the expectations that are put onto women. And it does that critique through this weird and often insufferable character who just pushes back against all of the norms that are pushed onto her. I think I was expecting this book to be a little bit more weird because I read it after reading Earthlings, which is one of the weirdest books I've ever read and a book that I absolutely loved and was so fucking disturbing. Amazing. But I don't think that was like hugely missing in Convenience Store Woman. I found the characters to be so compelling, so absurd, and so unlikable at times, but also relatable at the same time. I think this book was a better translation than Earthlings, and again, I think Murata just tackles the themes that she does perfectly. I love hearing what she has to say. Next up is The Embalmer. I'm putting that into forgettable because I don't really know what happened in it at all. This is supposed to be about a woman, and she's interviewing her father who worked as an embalmer, and he's telling her stories of all of the people that he has embalmed. So it's basically just like a ton of little stories about people dying, I guess, but it's kind of more than that, but it's also kind of less than that at the same time. We don't really know anything about the woman interviewing her father or the father himself. We learn a little bit about him through what he says, but not really anything. I think this is kind of just like a bunch of little vignettes, and it doesn't come together to create a coherent story. I certainly wouldn't have finished this book if it wasn't like 110 pages. It's just not that good. I think it's translated from French. It's not a great translation. I don't really have anything like hugely negative to say about it, but certainly nothing positive. I think it was experimental in a way that was kind of a testament to the author's ability, but it went just beyond me. And I certainly wouldn't really recommend it to anyone unless you think that sounds awesome and you're smarter than me, which like likely you are. So maybe I wouldn't recommend it. It was nothing. There's so many better books out there. One of which being Foster by Claire Keegan, which I'm going to put right at the top. I think everyone should read this, and I think you could all read it in one sitting. It's so short, and also there's very few words on every page. This is a novella about a little girl in Ireland, and she is sent to live with a foster family for a summer. There's not much more to it than that. The foster family has kind of a sad, secret past that this girl figures out partway through her stay there. It's a very moving and tender and beautiful little book. Foster paints such a vivid picture and is so atmospheric that a strong plot isn't really necessary to keep you moving through it. Next up, we have The New Masculinity, and I think I'm going to be an asshole and put this into Wish I Could Forget, because this is one of the worst written nonfiction books I've ever read in my life. I know it's scary that I've just put a book called The New Masculinity down at the very bottom here. I want to say that I do think Alex Manley has pretty reasonable ideas about masculinity and femininity and gender and patriarchy. I think that they're just one of the worst researchers of all time, and this is one of the most poorly researched books that has ever been published. All of the citations were at the bottom of the page, which is super annoying when sometimes half of the page would be taken up with the citation, and that's partly because the citations were incredibly long because they were links, because Alex Manley doesn't know how to read a fucking study. They would cite a study, and then you would go down to the bottom of the page, and you would see that they were not actually citing the study, they were citing like top 5 ways men do this, an internet article that explained the study in like layman's terms. You can't do that. I'm sorry, but you can't do that. It talks a little bit about Manley's like life history and how they have worked as like an internet article writer, and that is very obvious in the way that they have researched this book, which is basically just like clicking on BuzzFeed articles and then citing those instead of the actual studies that the articles themselves cite. I just think that this should have been an internet article. It should never have been a published book. Not if you're going to research it so fucking poorly. I don't know if that's just like some high horse I'm on because I've been in university for like 20 fucking years, but you can't do that. You absolutely cannot do that. Like, I swear to God, they were citing Wikipedia in this thing. Ridiculous. So stupid. I learned nothing from this book, and I kind of thought it was horrible. Next up, we have Malagash, which I'm sticking straight at the top. This book is kind of similar to Foster in that I read them very close to one another, and they're both short and about young girls. So actually, honestly, not similar at all. They're also both very atmospheric. But truly, they don't really have anything in common. Malagash is about, I think, like a young teenage girl, and her dad is dying of cancer, and she is trying to record everything he says, transcribe it, and turn it into a computer virus. It's a beautiful character portrait of all of the characters in this family and the dynamics between them and that develop between them over the story, and it portrays grief just perfectly. This book was super short. I think I read it in probably one sitting. I think you could read it in one sitting, and I think you'll love it. You'll love the characters, and it will make you feel so much. How to Pronounce Knife is a short story collection that I'm going to put into Disappointed Me. I was kind of expecting more from it. I'm not really sure why. I think I've seen it all around because it's Canadian and I'm Canadian. None of these stories were memorable, and they also weren't all that well written or compelling. I remember finishing this and thinking that it was quite boring and that nothing stood out to me, and that I wanted deeper explorations of the things that it was trying to explore about like Lao identity and immigrant identity. It does an okay job with them, but it just doesn't really get in depth into anything, and it also doesn't have like a strong plot, and it's short stories, so you never get attached to any of the characters. I just thought this was fine, but it didn't really have anything going for it. All right, next up we have The Promise by Sylvina Ocampo, I think her name is, and I'm gonna put that into forgettable. This book was published posthumously, which is something that I now realize like I don't really agree with. I mean, like, I don't have strong feelings about it, but I would never seek out a book published posthumously, especially one that has been finished posthumously, which this one was, and I don't think they did a good job with it. They tried to say that she had intended on all of these things that make the book feel like an unfinished draft. I don't know how you would possibly know that, and they didn't seem to have any evidence for that. And I think it really just felt like this should not have been something that was published. This is about a woman who's fallen off of a boat, and she's floating in the middle of the sea alone, and she's thinking about her life. I thought it was going to be a lot more about floating in the ocean, and somewhat for sure about thinking about her life. It's really not about being in the ocean at all. Like, there's maybe a couple pages total that deal with how she feels while she's in the ocean, and it's like at the beginning, and then everything else is just memories. But there are chunks, like large chunks of this book, that are repeated verbatim. The note at the beginning says that seems like it was something that she wanted. I think that she had just very slightly rewritten things and like had them in a stack on her desk, and the person who found it, whatever, her family member who decided to publish this thing, was like, oh yeah, she would have wanted this. Also, obviously there's no clear ending to this book. It felt like an unsatisfying read, and I felt totally confused throughout because I would just randomly start reading the same thing again, and I would be like, am I going fucking crazy? But I wasn't. That was intended. Next, we have Places Like These by Lauren Carter. This is another Canadian short story collection, and I'm popping that one straight into forgettable. I don't know a single thing that happened in any of these stories, and I couldn't tell you anything about it, except that it felt like, weirdly enough, the writing was quite good at the beginning, and then slowly got worse and worse and less edited, which I don't think makes sense because I feel like short story collections are not written like chronologically like that, but this certainly felt like it was, and that she had tried really hard for the first half and then kind of given up by the second half. Okay, there's been a couple flops, but next up we have Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is one of my favorite books I read this year, and that is going right to the top. Everybody should read this. If you haven't read it, like, get on that. Beloved was my first Toni Morrison and made me realize that she's my favorite author. I didn't need to read anything else, and I have. You'll see there's more of her books that I've read this year, but it was really just the one, and I was like, okay, yep, I get it. I understand why everybody talks about her in the way that they do. She is a writer unlike any other. I would like to tell you what this is about, but I don't think I should. I think you should go into it totally blind and just like let her writing wash over you. It's heavy as fuck, but it's also really hard to put down. It is so well written that it made me reconsider my preferences for books, because usually I want my books to be set in like a very specific time period where people can have phones, but they're not like a huge part of their life. And like COVID hasn't happened yet, if that makes any sense. Like, I want my books to be written in like the 2020s, but set in like 2007 to 17. This made me completely rethink that. After that, we have What Burns by Dale Peck, which is a short story collection that I'm popping into the very fucking bottom. Dale Peck seems to write things that are deliberately transgressive and taboo, but he doesn't do anything with it. Like, he's just like, isn't this shocking? Oh my god, look how shocking and perverse I am. And it seems like he's like all hoity-toity about it, but he's not saying anything. I thought it was stupid. I thought every story was kind of stupid in this book. I think it's crazy to be able to write stories that are so like shocking and disturbing and transgressive, and they're boring. That is a feat of an unskilled writer, and Dale Peck is one. I'm sorry. There was one story in here that I actually thought was a standout, like way better than the rest of them, where this guy kind of slowly realizes that everything in his life has been borrowed, and there's like a 9/11 aspect to it. It's really interesting. It leaves a lot of interpretation up to the reader, and I enjoyed that one. Everything else was dog, though. Next up, we have The Cook, which is translated from French by an author with a French name, and I'm going to put it into forgettable. This is like supposed to be a character portrait of a guy who's a cook, and it's written by a woman who's like maybe in love with him. We don't really ever get to know anything about her. Super, super tiny. The problem with it is that it's so tiny, and it's about cooking. This is always a problem I have with books with a central food motif, where like I'm bored of hearing you just list ingredients for page upon page upon page. And you cannot get away with that in a book that's like 100 pages long. The writing here was just like absolutely tedious. I think besides the lists, the writing was good, but there were so many lists I couldn't get past it. If I knew that this author didn't list things like this in her other work, I would probably be interested in checking out more from her. I certainly wouldn't recommend this book. There is no plot, and there's no intrigue, and there's no characterization in a story that is supposed to be a character portrait. Next up, we had to remove this post, which is going right into disappointed me. I wanted so much more from this, and I just didn't get it. We Had to Remove This Post is about a gay woman, and she's working, I think for Google, removing disturbing and illegal content from the internet. Whatever that job is called. My brain is mush right now. I've talked about so many books and there's so many more to go. She is a content moderator. I love that premise and I liked what the book was saying. I just don't think it said it very well. The story was so overly linear. It would often be like, okay, and then this happened, and then it would explain what happened, and then it would be like, and then this happened, and then it would explain more in depth. It was very short and it didn't really get into anything all that well. I personally enjoyed the twist ending of like the narrator. I don't want to spoil it. I enjoyed the twist ending. I think that it made me look back on the book with a different lens, which is always something that I like. I think because of the overly linear nature of the story and the very casual voice, this book often felt a bit juvenile or like unskilled. It is a translation. Who knows who's really to blame for that, but that is how I felt reading the English version of this. The thing this book does super well, like the most fantastic part, is exploring how exposure to radical content can radicalize you and how people deal with like having this job that has such a toll on your mental health and your view of the world. Like this group of coworkers would become the content that they were moderating, this racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic, anti-Semitic, like all of these different things they would say as like a joke to get it off their chest. But then like at what point does it cross the line into like it's not really a joke anymore? That was great. I just think everything else wasn't that good. And that even though that was great, it was explored in not very good writing. Next up, we have Ghostball by Sarah Moss, another book I've talked about ad nauseum, going straight into the top. Ghostball is about a teenage girl, and she goes on this trip to do this reenactment of Iron Age Britons with her parents, mainly her father, who is a history buff, and this obsessive, abusive man who wants everything to be perfect, and he takes out his frustrations on his daughter. This explores misogynistic men, it explores friendships between women, and it really gets into the head of these characters. You know how they're going to react to things, and you feel afraid of how they're going to react to things. So incredibly tense. The stakes feel so high the entire book, and it ends on just a perfect note. I couldn't put this book down, and I didn't want to put this book down. It was everything I wanted and more. Next up, we have a science fiction book, The Employees by Olga Hawn, and I'm going to put that into disappointed me. It wasn't that bad, it just was not my style of book, and I thought it was going to be better than it was. This is told in the format of like an internal investigation into what has happened on this like spaceship of researchers who are going to different planets, and they're finding these objects that they feel this very strong attachment to, and it leads to some crazy stuff happening that you don't really get all of the details of. This is a very short little book. It's like 100 pages and half of the pages aren't full. If you're really into the sci-fi genre, I think that this will probably be more for you than it was for me. I didn't like that I didn't really like connect to any of the characters. I didn't like how in the dark I was the whole time. It's so short, like at some point I should have understood what was happening, and I don't think I ever really did. That's definitely more of my fault. I don't think this was like objectively a bad book or poorly written or anything like that. I just didn't get it. I just wasn't smart enough for it. Next we have Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, and that is going into exactly what I wanted. I would not recommend this to everyone. It's brutally violent, super hard to read, incredibly heavy. I loved it. Could not put it down. This was my year of Fernanda Melchor. I read, I think, all of her books that have been translated into English. And I think that Paradise was my favorite. This is about two boys. There's a lot of like class dynamics explored here because one of them is very rich and the other one is quite poor, and he works in like the housing complex that this rich kid lives in. And they, over the course of the book, plan this act of violence against a woman in the rich kid's community. This book is violent and it's shocking. The language it uses is so over the top and horrific in a way that sometimes feels like it's too much, but also is definitely making a point throughout. This is about like the treatment of poor people, class dynamics, but also the treatment of women by young men who feel that they're owed something. It's tense and unsettling and vulgar, and it can be very hard to read, especially because Melchor has this very specific writing style that's super unique to her, where she just has these run-on sentences, sometimes like for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, pages and pages, it will just be one sentence. There's not often any paragraph breaks in her work, which is like super compulsive, but also incredibly panicky. Next up is You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South, which is a collection of short stories, and it's exactly what I want in a collection of short stories, and that's why I'm putting it into that tier. This is like Magical realism, almost a little bit of horror. There's like so much weirdness, and it deals with technology and humans' relationship to technology and how we rely on it to avoid our feelings and interacting with the world, but it doesn't really date itself with the way it handles technology. It's dark, strange, funny, thought-provoking. Every single story compelled me. Some were definitely better than others, and there were a couple of stinkers in here, but most of them were just great. Something I really felt was strong in this book is that the voices change with each narrator very well, but they also allow the author's sense of humor to shine through without making the voices like indifferentiatable. I think she just has a lot of skill, and I loved the themes she explored of grief and misogyny and technology. It was just exactly what I want in a short story collection. Next, we have The Test by Sylvan Newell, and that I'm putting into Wish I Could Forget, even though this is another case of why did I read it when it was exactly what it said it was going to be, which is corny as fuck. The Test is about a man who goes in to take a citizenship test, and something crazy happens. And then there's a twist, and the twist is a twist that has been done so many fucking times. I was like, oh yeah, I'm so shocked that's the twist. It was ridiculous. It was like it was trying to be an episode of Black Mirror and failing miserably. One thing this book did quite well was social commentary on what kinds of bodies are valued and which are not in like European society. Though I don't know if that was done well or just better than you would have expected from such a shit book. After that one, we have Wenjack by Joseph Boyden, and I think I'm going to put that one right at the top. It's very small, very easy to read, particularly if you're North American. I think this is a very good read. It's set in Canada, but a lot of the same stories happened to Indigenous people in America as well. And really, like Indigenous people all over the world, this follows the true story of a young boy who escapes his residential school and tries to walk back to his home. It bounces back and forth between perspectives, being the young boy traveling through the forest and the like spirits of the forest. Perfect way to tell this story. I thought that the writing was beautiful. The format really showed Boyden's skill, and this is just an important read. Next up, I have another science fiction short story collection, which I think I read because I had read Exhalation and liked it so much. I was like, maybe I just like sci-fi short stories. This was pretty good, but it was not that good, so I'm gonna put it into pretty good, but there's issues. Some of the stories in here were very long and quite slow. I did think that this was a fantastic translation. It honestly never felt like it had been translated. I think when I read this, I could recognize how objectively good it was, but also I was realizing like, oh, I don't like sci-fi that much. I liked Exhalation, but I don't love sci-fi. This is all very well conceived, well written, well translated, just not for me. I like how this questioned like what it means to be human and humanity and what it means to be like a living creature, sentience, all that. I just felt quite bored with it sometimes because it's really heavy on the science part of the science fiction. Next up, we have Assembly by Natasha Brown, and that one I'm also going to put into the very top category. This is a very quick book. You could read it in a sitting, and it explores things that I had never considered thinking about before. It's about a Black British woman, and she has gone to her white, wealthy boyfriend's parents' like garden party, and she's just considering life, particularly because of a diagnosis she's recently received. The conclusions that she comes to in this book are so fascinating, just a lens I had never thought about, and I want you to read it, and I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say anything else, but it was really, really good. After that, I read The Tiger in the Cage by, I think her name is Emma Bolden, and that is a memoir about a woman with endometriosis, and it was great. I think I'm going to put it into the top category again. I did not expect so many things to go into this. Feeling pretty good about myself for all of the really good books I read this year. It's so embarrassing when people are like, all of the books I read this year were 3 stars. Like, you just don't know what you like. And sometimes I feel that way about myself. So I'm liking seeing this long line at the top. Tiger in the Cage is about a woman with endometriosis. It's about the way women are treated in the medical system. It is a frustrating and heartbreaking read. There are some things about it that I was questioning, like her use of brand names in some spots that I'm just not used to, but someone told me that is an Alabama thing. But for a memoir to be a page turner is a feat, and she completed that feat with skill. A little bit I did think it was overwritten. It has very short chapters. There's like 100 chapters in this book, and I think that gave her a bit too much wiggle room. Some of the chapters felt like they didn't serve any purpose, but overall the messaging of this book and what it explores about the world we live in is incredibly important, and I'm very glad that I read it. Then we have The Pump, which is a short story collection. Read a lot of those this year. That one, I'm putting it into exactly what I wanted. This was a 5-star read for me. It's about a community, I think, in northern Ontario, somewhere in Ontario, and it's a weird community. Weird things are happening. The beavers are eating people. So it's a series of interconnected short stories, which is fun. I think that they all stood on their own, but it was more fun to be able to read them and think like, oh, I know that name from back in here, even though some of the connections were a little bit like tenuously strung together. Despite being very dark, the writing is like funny and good and like quite simplistic in a way that just works for the way these stories are told. This was great. This was just great. It was just a great book. After that, we have Death Valley, which I'm going to put at the top. I love Melissa Broder. This was my first like introduction into her work, and I'm obsessed with her. Death Valley is about a woman who's dealing with her father who's just gotten into a car accident, and with her husband who has this kind of mysterious illness, and just with what everybody needs from her in her life. And she goes out into the California desert and she goes inside of a cactus, and then a lot more stuff happens, but I don't want to tell you about it because it's so fucking fun. It's so funny. The short chapters in Melissa Broder's writing make you just fly through it, and she is so good at creating tension and stakes when there aren't a lot. Later on in this book, there are quite high stakes, but like you will feel like everything is so monumentous and so big in all of her writing, even when it's not. I think Melissa Broder is just like a weird, funky, funny person, and that comes through in all of the writing that I've read from her. Next up, I read This Is Not Miami by Fernanda Melchor. This is her collection of non-fiction but kind of fictionalized stories about her hometown of Veracruz, Mexico. This is going into pretty good, but there's some issues. This book made me realize that I really prefer Melchor's prose to her nonfiction writing. I just thought that some of the stories in here were a little bit boring. There's one story that's fucking crazy, this possession story that is so thrilling throughout the whole entire thing, and I think that that was much better than all of the rest of them. I like what Melchor explores in her writing, class hugely. There's this like anger towards the corruption of the government, but also this like prevailing love for her hometown. Next on our list is A Little Luck by Claudia Pinheiro, and I'm going to put that into the top category. I think anybody could find something in this book, and it's just all written so beautifully and executed so well. This is about a woman who flees her hometown in Argentina because of this incident that happens that she's blamed for and she's ostracized for. And she leaves her family in Argentina and lives like an entire different life in Boston, I think. And then she comes back to Argentina to this same community and tries to deal with the aftermath of kind of abandoning her family and being pushed out and what people think of her. Particularly, this centers around the son that she's left behind. This is suspenseful and well-paced. It starts as a log and then kind of morphs into a letter. I think the writing was reflective and confessional with thoughtful metaphors that were like easy to grasp, but not too easy to grasp. Like it didn't feel like they were holding your hand throughout. It left you to figure it out, but it was quite simple to figure out in a way that just balanced it perfectly. There's this repetition in the beginning that adds information to the story of this like violent, crazy incident that pushed her out of her community, and it adds it just like bit by bit by bit, so it unfolds just beautifully. Very, very, very well paced. After that, I read Signs Preceding the End of the World, which I'm going to pop into pretty good, but there's some issues. Someone on here who I appreciate so much explained what I was missing in this book, which is just like cultural context that I don't have because this is so specifically set in Mexico and in Mexican like folklore. So if you have that context, you should read this book because it was really well done. If you don't, you're not going to get it. Like me, I just didn't get it. I have a new appreciation for it after having it explained to me, but when I finished this book, I felt so lost and so confused. It's about this woman, young woman, and she's living in a border town in Mexico, and she crosses the US border, the Mexico-US border, to deliver a note to her brother. I'm just going to leave it at that. There's so much more to it. If you don't have this cultural context piece, maybe skip this one. It just probably won't click for you if you don't have that. After that, I read The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, which was my first Enriquez. This was also the year of Mariana Enriquez. I am going to put that one into exactly what I wanted. But also, there were some issues with it. It's kind of lower on this list. This is one of her collections of short stories. She does like horror and social commentary combined, with her stories being really deeply set in Argentina and mostly focusing on women who are ostracized, often mental illness, which I think this has a lot of. I find her characters often have a lot of paranoia and fear in their lives. I think this book treats with a lot of gentleness and tenderness women who are sick and twisted and weird, and also like reacting to a violently patriarchal society. My one problem with this collection, and honestly with just like how she writes short stories, is that often stories feel like they're leading up to something and then they kind of just fizzle out at the end. Like they can feel a little bit pointless or leave you feeling a little bit lost. Sometimes I want closure with a short story, and I don't often get that with Enriquez's short stories. But what I do get is great prose and amazing premises, and that's enough to keep me reading her work. After that one, we have Sula by Toni Morrison, and I'm going to put that into Everyone Read This Now, and I think probably I'm going to put all of Toni Morrison's work that I read this year into that category. Sula is about the relationship between two young girls who grow up throughout the novel, and they come apart and they come together. This is like a character portrait, but a character portrait of a lot of people in this town, and that is something that Toni Morrison does very well, is this like interconnected web of characters where you get so much context about everything that is happening in this little world of this book. I found all these characters to be so fleshed out, and I loved like coming to an understanding of their very unique and strange worldviews. Toni Morrison is so witty and so sharp, and that is just shines through in Sula. This book feels like a living portrait of friendship and grief and betrayal and small town politics, and I loved it. After that, I have Life Ceremony by somebody whose name I can't see, and I'm popping that into pretty good, but there's issues. I thought about it for a second and I remembered things that happened in it, so it went up a category from forgettable. Life Factory follows, I think, 3 different workers at this huge, like, complex factory that takes up many city blocks and becomes the entire lives of the people who work there. It does a great job of conveying the feeling of being a meaningless cog in this machine that is so much bigger than you, and doing work that doesn't feel like it has any purpose. It's surreal, intense, and unsettling. It shifts very abruptly from scene to scene and kind of leaves you feeling disoriented. I think what this book honestly does very well is the way that it impacts the reader and how the reader is perceiving it. Like with that disorientation thing, and also with the 3 characters, it's never really clear whose perspective it is until they talk about what job they do, so you as the reader are reducing them to just their job in the same way their world is doing that. I felt like at the end of the book, the plot kind of fell to the side here as the characters' connections became more of the focal point, which I didn't love. Next up, we have Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata. This is her short story collection, and I'm popping that in the same category. Pretty good, but there's some issues. One thing I loved about Life Ceremony is that there were little tastes of Earthlings in many of these stories, and having already read Earthlings, it felt like I was understanding that Earthlings was the book that she had always wanted to write, or like what she had always been working towards. Loved that. Love the themes she deals with like social norms and taking them and flipping them on their heads and making you realize that you can like so easily take these things for granted that are actually like so fucking weird. She really questions how women are expected to live and behave in all of her work, and she does it very well. This translation was not the best. All of her works have been translated into English by the same woman, and I don't know why it's so strikingly different between the 3 of them. But like what's really at the core of her writing, these themes and these insights are so thought-provoking that it's pretty easy to get past a poor translation. Next up, we have We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and I'm popping that into disappointed me, but it's pretty high up in here. It was an okay book. I was thinking I was gonna like it a lot more than I actually did. This is about a freaky little girl, Mary Cat, and she lives with her sister after the rest of her family has died, and they've been ostracized by the town that they live in. So they live very isolated in this big mansion. And then a cousin shows up, and he tries to take over the very like ritualistic and specific ways that they run their household. And her older sister is okay with this, but Mary Cat very much is not. She's so incredibly obsessive. It's a gothic domestic horror. I loved the way that it dealt with the older sister being so like needed by everyone in her life. Like everyone is just like, do this for me, do that for me, do this for me. And I just wanted her to explode. And I wish that she just does all these like absolutely thankless jobs and they just take over her life. She is expected to just drop everything whenever anybody, including the narrator, wants something. I thought the devotion and the loyalty between the 2 sisters was beautiful. My main problem with this book, that was a problem through the entire thing, is that it is so fucking wordy. This was so overwritten. It's a short book, and still there are like half of the words could have not been in here. It's one of the densest books I've ever read, and that made it quite boring, even though it had a plot that I think I should have loved. Next up is another short story collection, Get in Trouble by Kelly Link, and I'm also popping that one into Disappointed Me. This book, first of all, it leaned a little bit more towards fantasy than magical realism, which is not my preference. I thought that this book thought it was really smart and was like patting itself on the back for it, and I, as the reader, just did not care for that. Because the stories in this collection were so incredibly long, they didn't follow the typical structure of a short story, which is where you're meant to give as much information as possible as soon as possible. It just wanted to leave you in the dark, and it wanted to be like, I know something you don't know. And then by the time like 50 pages in, you would finally figure out what it was that you were supposed to know. It wouldn't even feel satisfying because it was just annoying at that point. And it wasn't even like you'd know a secret that far in. It was like you would learn what the premise of the entire story was. I just thought this book was really irritating, and I had unreasonably high expectations because the cover is awesome and the author has the best tattoo I've ever seen in my life. She just wanted to be smarter than me, and I just hated that. After that, we have A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emer McBride, and I'm putting that one into Wish I Could Forget. I did not read this at the right moment, but I still think I would have hated it nonetheless. How do I explain this book? This is written in a stream of consciousness that is unlike any other book that's ever been written, and I personally felt like I was being dragged kicking and screaming through it. Some of the sentences were just like absolute gibberish. I would actually say most of the sentences are, and you had to figure out so much, intuit so much, and not in a way that was fun, in a way that was taxing. I was desperate for this book to end. It bordered on misery porn, but even though I was inside this narrator's head, I still didn't really get to understand how she felt about anything. I felt like this book was such a monumental effort to read with such little payback. The sort of premise is this is about a girl, and she grows up through the book, and her brother has brain cancer when he's a kid and he survives it. It's kind of about the impacts that has on her and her life. I just really hated it. I just really thought it was awful. I think that book is recommended by people who are pretentious as fuck, and I'm sorry to say it. Next up, we have We Want What We Want by Alex Olin. I'm also putting that in the Wish I Could Forget category. This was one of the most poorly edited books I've ever read. It's another short story collection. Every single story was the exact same. It's about someone with a dead parent figuring something out in life. There's no magical realism, which is always what I want in short stories, and the writing was terrible. Often you would read a sentence and you would be like, I can see exactly how this should have been phrased, and it was phrased in the most awkward way possible. Lots of grammar and spelling mistakes. It felt just like cobbled together and honestly quite boring. Next on this list, which it feels like the longest list of all time, is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. That one's going into the top category. I think if you haven't read it, you should probably go read it. It can be a little bit dense and a little bit boring. If you don't often read books from the 50s, I don't know how easy it will be for you to read. James Baldwin's writing is beautiful, and that will definitely push you through it. It explores identity, sexuality, and morality in a time where it was seen as immoral to be a gay or bisexual man. Even though the narrator was kind of detached, I really felt like I was inside of his head and I understood his mindset. I liked his selfishness. I thought it was interesting how he treated the people in his life with this recklessness when it came to the care given to their emotions, because he could not figure himself out and he just wanted what he wanted and he didn't know what to do with it. After that, I have Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and that one is going into Disappointed Me. I thought I was going to like this. I did not like this. I think I read a bad translation of it. If you don't know, Crime and Punishment is about a guy and he commits this senseless murder and then he spends the rest of the book going crazy with paranoia about it. It was just so boring to me. The pacing was insane. It drags on and then it's so fast for like 50 pages and then it's so slow for like 200 pages and it just keeps doing that. I kind of liked the philosophizing, talking about like the nature of crime, the nature of man, but sometimes it became like so academic that I was bored by it. The strong suit of this book is that it's very atmospheric and the characters are like vivid and ridiculous and over the top and insane. I think that for me, if it was 300 pages shorter, I would have liked it. Or maybe if I had read what is like accepted as a good translation, I would have liked it. It just was not. It was a bad experience. After that, I read Milkfed by Melissa Broder, and that one, you know it, is going into the very top. Part of my love for this book is the context in which I read it, which is that I had just finished Crime and Punishment, and this is the antithesis of Crime and Punishment. Short chapters, short book, compulsive, easy to read, like simple enough language. It's just everything Crime and Punishment was not. This is about a woman with a complex relationship with her mother and an eating disorder, often come hand in hand, and she becomes obsessed with this Orthodox Jewish woman, falls in love with her, and they develop this relationship that is so exciting. The stakes in this book feel so high. I was kicking my feet, I was giggling, I was like the entire time I was reading it because everything was like so fucking intense. I couldn't put it down. The freedom of the Orthodox Jewish woman and like her neutrality about her body and all of the things that the narrator is like so obsessed with and so regimented and regulated with. Loved the contrast there. The characters are realistic and they're well-rounded, and everything this said and explored it did just perfectly. I loved it. I love Milk-Fed, one of my favorite books of the year. After that, I read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, and I am popping that one into Disappointed Me. I did like the plot of this. I thought that it was interesting. It follows this woman with like pretty extreme mental illness being treated with like electroshock therapy and all the fucked up things that they did to women. There's never an expectation of autonomy for her. Like she never even thinks like, oh, I wish I had some agency in this situation. It's just expected that things will happen to her and be done to her. The problem with this book is that it's so fucking bigoted. Like genuinely, Sylvia Plath hates everybody. There are some bigoted things in this book that are so incredibly specific. She gets every single community with a little comment off to the side that has nothing to do with anything. It's kind of crazy. And I think that was hard to move past. I know it was written in a specific time, but like lots of people in that time were not bigoted in the way this book is, so I don't know how great of an excuse that was. I thought it was interesting. I complained about this book a little bit in a video that I made about reading older books, and someone said like, well, you have to separate the art from the artist. And I was like, my complaint is with the text. Like that idea has gone way too far. That now just means I should be able to like problematic things. And like, sure, I'm not getting into that, but to say to someone you should separate the art from the artist when the art is the thing I'm complaining about, so ridiculous. Honestly, so funny. After that, I read Frankenstein. That's popping right into the top. If you don't like books written in 1818, don't read this because it is written. It's archaic. It's dense. It can be a little bit slow. Like the pacing is not the pacing of a modern book. I get it though. I understand why Frankenstein is what it is. This is one of my favorite books I've ever read. Beautifully written. Shelley has such a perfect control of language, and it's the best gay allegory that's ever existed. So that's all you really need to know about it. Go read Frankenstein. Then we have The Bluest Eye, which again is going into the very top. Everyone should read this. I think this is Toni Morrison's maybe most popular or like most known work. I think it's also her first work. Fascinating to see. There's this note at the end of the edition I read where she has come back like many years later to talk about it, and she's just like ripping this book to shreds, talking about all the things she thinks didn't work and that she hated. I thought it was very like poignant on how critical we are of ourselves, because I had just finished what I thought was almost a perfect book, and she's like, this didn't work, that didn't work, I didn't like this, and it's like, oh my god, like, what? The Bluest Eye is about a young girl who wants blue eyes. She's like coveting whiteness and seeing how her being a young black girl affects like the way people perceive her, particularly when it comes to beauty. It's so much more than that. And this is another like interconnected web of characters. It gives you so much context. It tells you about so many different people, and it does it all beautifully. I think everyone is always so well developed in Toni Morrison's work. This is no exception. This book is devastatingly heavy though. Keep that in mind if you're going to read it. I'm going to change the lighting a little bit because I feel like it got pitch black outside and now it's really, really warm in here. Then I have If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, which is so hard to rate because part 1 and 2 I would have put into Disappointed Me, but then part 3 brought it all together, and honestly I think is going to make me put it into pretty good, but there's issues. So If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English follows this toxic relationship between these two people, an American woman with Egyptian heritage who moves to Egypt to like connect with her roots, and an Egyptian man who's always lived there. What I hated about part 1 is that each small chapter opens up with this like thing, this format of like question, colon, and then this Rupi Kaur ridiculous Tumblr poetry question that like oh my god, made me cringe every time. And then the paragraph following would be beautiful, great writing. I don't know how there was such a disconnect between those two things, but it was distracting on almost every single page. Part 2 was a little bit better. Its gimmick was footnotes that I thought were often just placed in to be a gimmick and didn't really give me anything. Part 3, which I said brought it all together, was formatted as this writing workshop with a whole bunch of people who had never been a part of the book so far, and they were workshopping a part of this book that we had just read that we don't get to know. It was like this final part that someone in the workshop says you should just end the book before this final part. That was fascinating. Such an interesting play with structure and format. It was perfect, like actually perfect, and it made me kind of forgive everything else in the book. After that, I read Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. That one is going into exactly what I wanted. Is it, or is it going one up? No, I'm going to keep it there. This is a short story collection. I loved all of the stories in here. All of the premises were so good. They all felt like they ended with some closure. There was kind of horror, kind of magical realism. Just perfect, exactly what I want in a short story collection. There's this one story in the middle that's quite long, and it's told as like the synopsis for a whole bunch of Law and Order episodes the author has just made up, and it tells a story through this. Fascinating, testament to her skill. This is a great collection. After that, I read Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. This one I'm putting into exactly what I wanted, but it is below Paradise. I liked Paradise more than this. I think that was partly the context in which I read this. I don't think that I was ready to read a book that is so incredibly heavy in the way Hurricane Season is, but Hurricane Season is one of the most skilled pieces of writing that I've ever read. It kind of follows what happens in this community after a shocking act of violence. It gets into the politics of like masculinity and queerness without being super overt with it, and it is really good. But it is also one of the heaviest and most difficult to read books I have ever read, because you pick it up and like I said, she has these crazy long sentences, crazy long paragraphs. You can't stop reading it, but you need to. Like, you need to take time for yourself when you're reading this book, and it doesn't let you. After that, I read Earth Eater by Dolores Reyes, and I'm going to put that one into... It's not forgettable. I remembered it. I think I'm putting it into pretty good, but there's some issues. This was not the best translation, not the best editing I've ever read. There were some characters whose names were just like sometimes spelled wrong, not as a nickname. It would be like Michael, but E-A-L at the end. This is about a woman, and she eats dirt, and when she eats the dirt, it tells her things about where women who have been the victims of femicide are located or buried or whatever. Because that premise is so interesting to me, I was able to get through parts of this book that were not that great and enjoy it by the end of it. Then I read Shy by Max Porter, which I'm going to pop into forgettable. Whatever. It's about a troubled young boy. It might be unforgettable because I have pushed it out of my brain, because it definitely put me back into the headspace of being like a troubled kid with very little control over their emotions, and that was uncomfortable as fuck. Shy tried to play with format using like different fonts and italics and bolding, and I thought that it was kind of corny. What was really great about this book is the way it ended. The whole time I was reading, I was like, how is he gonna do this? And I think he did a great job of not cheapening the story, but also giving it like a satisfying and slightly hopeful ending. After that, I read Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. Short story collection, exactly what I wanted. Perfect short stories, the way she does body horror and like womanhood and weird women. Amazing. Just like awesome. I love puberty as body horror. That was the first story in here. Perfect. This warmed me to Julia Armfield and made me certain that I wanted to read Our Wives Under the Sea, which we'll get to. I did read it this year. It's somewhere in here. I love her writing. It's simple. It's not like over the top. It gets the job done, and it does the job well. After that, I read Lemon, which is a book I'm putting into forgettable because I don't remember a damn thing about it. I think Lemon is about a teenager who's murdered, and then it goes through a whole bunch of different perspectives of women who are close to this murder, but it's not really like a murder mystery. I couldn't tell you anything about it. Let's move on. I read The Pink Hotel by Liska Jacobs. That's also going into forgettable. I read this when I was reading ugly books. This was fun, but it was so silly. It's about this couple, and they go stay at this hotel, and there's a whole bunch of rich people there, and the husband is trying to get a job at the hotel. It kind of has the vibes of the first season of The White Lotus, but not really. I think it was kind of compelling. It was very slow in the beginning, but after that it was kind of compelling with like these rich people attitudes and social customs that this woman who's a lot poorer than them is not used to, and her trying to like fit in with them. You would think that this book had a better exploration of class dynamics. It didn't. It was a very shallow book, but it was fun and entertaining. After that, I read After the Sun by Jonas Aika, I think. I'm putting that one into Wish I Could Forget. It was so weird and so stupid. I thought that, okay, partly my fault. I thought all these stories were interconnected and they weren't. And the whole time I was reading it, I was like, at one point, this is all going to come together and it's all going to make sense. It never did. It was weird for the sake of being weird, and it was annoying to read. After that one, I read Dogs of Summer by Andrea something. I can't see her name. And that one is gonna pop into forgettable. I don't know much of what happened in here. This is about two girls who are like 13. Definitely puts you in the headspace of being 13, especially if you were a quiet 13-year-old and you had friends who were a lot more outgoing than you. That's the story of this narrator's life. I liked the subtlety of like, are they gay or are they just like girls who are obsessed with each other? I don't think that it needed to be overt, and it wasn't, and that it was better for it. Even though this book is very short, I found it a little bit boring. After that one, another ugly book, that was My Armenian Friend. I'm putting that one into exactly what I wanted, actually. I'm surprised by that. I read this book thinking it was going to be ridiculous and silly. It was so heartfelt without being overly earnest or corny. It was a great character portrait. It really got into the head of these like young boys. It taught me a lot about like wherever it's from. Okay, maybe it didn't teach me that much because I can't remember where this book is set. I want to say it's set in Russia. Okay, it taught me a little bit about like the politics of Russia. It had an interesting plot and interesting characters. I really don't have any complaints about it. It's just like good literary fiction with a ridiculous cover. After that, the last ugly book was Jack of Spades by Joyce Carol Oates. Putting that one into Wish I Could Forget. It was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous thriller. It was just bad. It was really bad. Joyce Carol Oates is a prolific writer, and I have heard, maybe even just from my comment section on the video where I talked about this, that she's been phoning it in. She has not been writing good work for the past few years, and her earlier work is a lot better. This is all I've ever read from her, but I'm pretty sure it's a great example of that because it was pretty terrible. It was a pretty bad book. Then we have Shut Up You're Pretty, which is another short story collection. That one is going into Disappointed Me. It was not really short stories. It was more like telling a life story through these little vignettes, and I didn't think that they were all that interesting, and I didn't care about the character that they were following. They were very short, but I was still quite bored by the whole thing. After that one is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro. That one's top category. It was awesome. This is about a woman with Parkinson's, and she's trying to figure out her daughter's death. She's convinced her daughter did not end her own life, and she is trying to get someone to help her figure it out because she is debilitated by her Parkinson's, and she feels like she can't figure it out, but she can phone in a favor. Like a Little Luck, this is like social commentary, but also character portraits, but also maintaining the fast pace and the like propulsion of like almost like a crime thriller with fantastic writing and a great translation on top of all of that. It was amazing. I love this book. Then I read Jazz by Toni Morrison, also going into the top. After Beloved, this is my second favorite Toni Morrison work, and I feel like nobody talks about it enough. Jazz is about everyone surrounding this shocking act of violence that happens in a community. This one is very much character portraits of everyone, like so many different like degrees of relationship to this central act of violence. Like it'll be the main dude and then the main dude's mom and then his mom's mom and then his dad's life story, and it's just like all written so perfectly and connected so perfectly. I loved it. Jazz is one of my favorite books of all time. Then we have Magma by a woman with the most Icelandic name I've ever seen. I'm so sorry. I can't even try. And that's going into Disappointed Me. This is about a woman who is in an abusive relationship, and it is a very shallow exploration of abusive relationships. It's just like this dude who has nothing good about him, and he never does anything nice. And it's not a accurate portrayal of emotional abuse, other than the fact that you kind of understand why she's in this relationship because she has a very low opinion of herself. She just really hates who she is. But overall, I just found it to be kind of unbelievable and felt like a book that someone who didn't really know anything about abuse had written. Then we have The Great Gatsby, which I am popping into pretty good, but there's some issues. I was expecting to hate this because my sibling told me that it was one of the worst books they had ever read. I thought it was fun. I thought there was a fun humor in this book. The plot was interesting enough. It is a little bit overwritten, maybe a tiny bit dense, but not as much as I expected, being from the 20s. And there is such a beautifully created atmosphere. This is so much a time and a place, and you feel so immersed in that time and place. I thought it was fun. I thought it was incredibly fun. After that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, straight into the top. This is about a woman. It's kind of a science fiction book, but not really. It's about a woman who has grown up in this like cage underground with a whole bunch of other women. They don't know why they're in there. They don't remember what happened, and then they escape. And it's about like what happens when you grow up without men around, and their lives and their escape and what happens on the outside. There's so much to this. I don't want to tell you anything. I want you to just go read it. It's so good. It is very heavy, and there are no chapter breaks in this. There are no places to stop, but you need to be able to find a place to stop because it weighs you down. The entire read is desolate and bleak and depressing and so fucking insightful. Then we have Chlorine by Jade Song, which I'm popping into disappointed me. This book had so much potential. It's about this teenager, high schooler. She is like obsessed with being a swimmer, and then she becomes a mermaid, and it's like gory body horror. But then it's just so poorly written that the premise is just thrown out the fucking window. The writing could be so melodramatic that I was cringing. There were parts of this that I wanted to just like turn away from because I could not read it because the writing was just like so over the top and so bad. I felt like it was beating me over the head with what it was trying to say. It didn't trust me for a single second, and that made it a very tedious read. There was something here, and that's why I think it's like the epitome of disappointed me, because the premise and the themes and the symbolism, they all had something to them. They just could not be executed with such a amateur writer. Maybe if Jade Song publishes like 5 more books, I'll read her 7th book, because I think that she has something. She has something, but she needs to develop her skills a lot more before I'm interested in reading something more from her. Okay, I'm really gonna speed it up now. Like, actually, for real, I have to get through this. This is taking me forever, and I've already talked about all of these books on my channel, so we're gonna go fast. Next book is The Shards by Bret Easton Ellis. That one's going into exactly what I wanted. It is so gory, so fucking long. It stuck with me forever. I still think about the way he did the gore in this book and how impactful it was. I felt sick to my stomach reading this shit. At the end of the day, it's a thriller, but it also follows this narrator who is a closeted teenage boy, and that is heartbreaking and so full of paranoia that you adopt as the reader. I loved how much this left me questioning. I loved how many different interpretations there can be of this book and how everybody thinks something different happened. It's so fun, so dark, so disturbing. Then we have Severance by Ling Ma, which I'm popping into disappointed me because I feel like everybody's always talking about how good this book is, and I just did not get it. It was fine, deeply forgettable. It's the story of this woman living in this dystopian world where most of the population has died, and there's kind of 2 timelines, one being her working her job while most of everyone on the planet has already died, and then one of her later on with this group of survivors. And the survivors are led by this kind of cultish patriarchal figure who's really frustrating to read about, and I think a well-developed character. There just like wasn't all that much to this book that kept me super interested in it, and no longevity in my mind. I will never think about Severance again. This will be the last time in my life I think about Severance. Then we have You Will Love What You Have Killed, which I'm gonna put into Wish I Could Forget. This was a terrible book by a guy who just is a bad horror writer. You know, when they're just like obsessed with like being disgusting and taboo and gross. That was this book. He did all those things and he didn't do anything with them, and I thought it was stupid and frustrating to read. Then we have My Annihilation. I'm going to put that into pretty good, but there are some issues. It is in some ways a silly book because it treats psychology as this thing that it completely is not. Like, it acts like you can very easily brainwash people, and it tries to back itself up with like evidence and studies and like all this ridiculousness. But at the end of the day, the story is so fun that I could look past it. If you are like an annoying dude with a psychology major, don't read this. You will hate it so much. I thought it was fun and entertaining. It's like kind of incredibly convoluted, and there are so many twists and turns that you have to figure out along the way. And again, it's just fun. That entirely sums up this book. It's a fun book. Then we have Bunny by Mona Awad. same category. Pretty good, but there's some issues. I think it disappointed me a little bit, but not enough to put down in that category. I've heard so much about Bunny being a very weird and creepy book. I thought it was kind of weird and kind of creepy. It was nothing special to me. After Bunny, I read Nobody, Somebody, Anybody by Kelly McClory, and that one was exactly what I wanted it to be. An obsessive woman who's just like messing up her life. She has a really weird voice. The writing is fine. It's nothing special. It's nothing terrible. It's a great addition to the best genre, women losing their shit and behaving badly. It's very tense with that quiet tension where you're like holding your breath, waiting for everything to come crashing down. I loved it. I loved my experience of reading it. I just thought it was really fun. After that, we have People from My Neighborhood, which disappointed me. It is another short story collection. The back made it sound like it was a lot weirder than it ended up being. There's a lot of very short stories, and you can't really connect to anybody throughout the whole thing. It's also like quite wholesome and like earnest, like, oh, little vignettes of this neighborhood. Not what I want. Not what I'm looking for. Give me darkness. This didn't have it. Then Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. That one I cannot recommend to everyone. It's too crazy, but it was exactly what I wanted. It is so disturbing, so dark, so disgusting, and so perfectly written. Her skill with the English language is crazy. This is about a woman who becomes a middle school teacher so she can prey on her biggest sexual fantasy, which is middle school boys. The most hateable character of all time. She's truly sociopathic, and her voice is just so disgusting, so selfish. And again, so perfectly written. You couldn't get away with this if it was not perfectly written, and it is. After that, we have A Touch of Jen by Beth Morgan. That one also is going into exactly what I wanted. This is really two genres. The first half of the book is lit fic, and then the second half is like magical realism horror, so I can't recommend it to everyone because you have to like both of those things and be okay with both of them to like this book. A Touch of Jen is about this couple, and they're obsessed with this woman, Jen, who was a co-worker of the man in the couple. I love the like dual obsession that doesn't really have anything to do with jealousy. I think that's really unique to this book, and I love the off-the-walls weirdness that happens in the second half of it. It gets so crazy. It gives you these little sprinkles through the first half that like weird stuff is going to happen, but you never know if it's going to play through, and then it does, and it's just absurd. It's just such a fucking weird book. I loved it. After that, Catcher in the Rye, it was pretty good, but there's some issues. Nothing happens in this book. Holden Caulfield moseys around New York and does nothing. He goes out for drinks a bunch of times. I think it was fun to get in on like this book that everybody is always talking about and that is so polarizing. I felt pretty indifferent towards it. I don't care. I don't love Holden and I don't hate Holden. I just don't really care about him. I think he's kind of an annoying teenage boy. Weren't we all annoying teenagers? He's very relatable in that aspect, but it doesn't make me like him. After that, I read Boy Parts by Eliza Clark, and that was exactly what I wanted it to be. And I can't recommend it to everyone because it is definitely a horror book, and there are some issues with it, but nothing that made me not love it. I loved hating the characters in this book. Absolutely insufferable. No self-reflection. Think they're better than everybody else in such a fun and fascinating way. Boy Parts follows this woman who takes sexually explicit photos of men in vulnerable positions. It explores, obviously, gender dynamics, patriarchy, misogyny, desire, and like who is behind the camera. So repulsive. Very hard for me to put down. I think that this just had a lot of momentum throughout the whole thing. There are so many different plot points, and it's not like a hugely long book. I really enjoyed it. Then we have A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers, which is a book that I fucking hated. It disappointed me, but even more than that, I think I'm going to put it into Wish I Could Forget because I wanted it to be so much better than it was. This is supposed to be about a woman who's a serial killer, and she's a cannibal, and she eats the men that she kills. And it's not just random men. Like, it's men that she has a history with that she kills. And so you get this history, but that's really it. Like, you get a long history and then a really short, tiny little bit of her killing them and eating them. It's like 2 pages for each man. Most of this book, though, is food lists. Telling me about foods I'll never eat because I'm a normal human being and I don't know what duck liver tastes like. There's also a tedious amount of food metaphors. I had enough of that, probably 5 pages in. More than anything, this book is just like little like snippets of information in what I hear is the style of Donna Tartt, but the writing is not good enough to pull it off. It felt like the author just went on like a Googling spree to pad out this book that really had nothing to it. At the core of it, there was very little plot, there was very little characterization, and that was hugely disappointing for me, and I wish I had never read it. Then I read The Center, which was also terrible. I think I'm going to put that one into disappointed me. It's about this woman who goes to this very secretive center where you can learn to speak any language in the world. And the twist is so predictable and so dumb and so ridiculous. I still can't get over it. I think that I listened to this as an audiobook, and I think it was read very well, which kind of distracted me from how poorly it was written. Something I say about a lot of books, this had a very obviously missing class component that needed to be explored and wasn't, and felt crazy by the end of it that we had just like left out this thing that was so important to the plot. If I could describe the center in one word, it would be stupid. I thought it was a stupid book. Okay, then I read Jane Eyre, which is such a hard book to place because it's similar to Crime and Punishment in that I hated reading it and it took me a long time to get through. It's a very dense and archaic 1800s novel, but also after reading it, I'm glad that I read it. So I feel like it kind of deserves a category of its own, but I'm gonna put it into pretty good. It was certainly not forgettable, especially with me being someone who reads a lot of like horror and kind of more gothic books. I can see its influences everywhere now. If you like darker and more disturbing books and you also like really old long books, you will love this. It's great for you. It's not great for me, but I will never regret reading it. Then I have Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. That's going into the top category, which we can't see anymore because there's too many things on this thing. Mrs. Dalloway is so good. You just have to get through the first like 20 pages where you have no idea what's going on, and then you just get it. If you've never read Woolf, like I hadn't when I read this, you got to get into her. Her writing is impeccable. There's a reason she is so popular and still like such a big part of the literary canon 100 years later. Mrs. Dalloway is almost entirely plotless. It follows a woman, Clarissa Dalloway, as she prepares for a party that she's throwing that night. But it jumps around between point of view and perspective. It doesn't just follow her. There's so many people in this story, and you get a lot of information about all of them, even though it's a short little book. Then I read The Vegetarian, which is, I think, it's either exactly what I wanted or it's pretty good, but there's issues. It's at the bottom of one category or the top of the other. I'm going to put it into exactly what I wanted because I love a deranged woman, and this is a deranged woman story. It's about a woman, and she's having these dreams, and they make her go vegetarian, but it's a lot more than that. She kind of just loses her mind over the course of the book. It's told through multiple perspectives, not alternating, just like three. I think her husband, her brother-in-law, and then her sister. We never get her perspective. Another book that explores the expectations of women and like normality. I think it was very well done. I do think it kind of went over my head though. Then we have Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is her best work that she's ever published, or at least it's ever been translated into English. It was exactly what I wanted, but it's like 700 pages. I can't say everybody would like this. The audiobook is perfection. If you're gonna read this, I think you should listen to it. It's like 27 hours long, so it is very much a commitment, but it's a commitment that's worth it. This is a horror novel. It is so big and ambitious, I can't describe it. I've recommended it before. I have not been able to describe what happens in it. I can't sum it up. It's just great. That's all I can say. Then we have All's Well by Mona Awad. This one was exactly what I want. Well, no, this one was pretty good, but there's issues. I liked it better than Bunny. I don't think Mona Awad has like the best writing I've ever read in my life. It can be pretty cliche at times. I think that there needs to be more editing in some of her work. Definitely this one, but I loved the premise. I thought that this book was made to entertain, and it entertained the fuck out of me. This is about a woman in chronic pain, and she is a theater director at a college, and then all of a sudden her pain is cured. So much more to it than that. It's creepy, it's disturbing, it's weird. I love a woman losing her grip on reality. This does it fantastically. After that was Out by Natsuo Karino. This one is also pretty good, but there's some issues. I liked the premise of like these women, and they're working the night shift at a factory, and a lot of them are quite poor. Like they've all been driven to work this terrible job for a multitude of reasons, and one of them kills her husband, and then they all kind of help her cover up this murder. There's a lot of paranoia and fear throughout the whole thing. I just didn't love the ending of this. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I think it's worth reading anyway, but I don't know. I felt very conflicted about it. After that is Time as a Mother by Ocean Vuong. This is a poetry collection, and this one disappointed me. I had read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous and thought, wow, this really should just have been poetry. This is too poetic to be prose. I bet Ocean Vuong is a really great poet. And then I read a poetry collection from him, and I didn't think it was all that good. I think it's pretty incoherent. I also think it can sometimes be a little bit too melodramatic, too aware that it is poetry. It's just like not what I like in a poetry collection. There was one standout poem, a few standout lines, but overall, this was not great in my opinion. After that one was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. That was exactly what I wanted it to be. This is about a woman, and she's married to a woman who goes into a submarine and she's stuck down there for 6 months. And then they are dealing with the aftermath of this incident. There's body horror. It's creepy. It's weird. I loved it. I think it was really good. There were definitely some problems with it. I don't think it was a perfect book, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. After that one was Heaven by Miyako Kawakami, and I'm going to say this one disappointed me. I've heard some really good things about this by people whose tastes I really trust. I thought it was boring. I don't know if it was because I listened to it on audiobook. It felt like there was no plot really, or like call to action. Like I didn't really understand what the drive of the book was. And I thought the ending was like a little bit corny and ridiculous. There is that one line though that I definitely like reblogged on Tumblr 10 years ago, and that line alone almost makes me want to put it in Pretty Good But There's Issues, but I just didn't like it that much. After that was Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh. That one was pretty good, but there's issues. She just has some crazy pacing problems, but I liked the obsessiveness and eroticness of this book. That's definitely not a word. It's like not sexual, but it's very erotic. I think that can be really fun. This does a pretty good job with it. It's not amazing. After that was Endgame by Samuel Beckett. This is a play. I don't really know why I've included it. I am putting it into Wish I Could Forget because I read this for school. I just wrote an essay on it and I just am tired of it. I hate Endgame. It's absurd, but not in a fun way. Whatever. I'm sorry. I don't get Samuel Beckett. After that, I read Your Fathers, Where Are They? And The Prophets So They Live Forever by Dave Eggers. This one was pretty good. I was surprised by it. I actually found myself really enjoying this book while reading it. It's a super fast read. It's really easy to read. I think there are some aspects of it that kind of quietly show Eggers' skill. I still think reading any of his works, you'll think he's kind of a douchebag, but that's just how it is with Dave Eggers. This is about a man with a very strange, rigid worldview who kidnaps another man to try to figure some things out about the world. He feels that he knows this other man. He's an astronaut. He knows the astronaut very well. The astronaut doesn't really remember him at all. There's so much more to it than that. I don't want to spoil it. I would recommend this book. Then we have The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This I think is exactly what I wanted. This is 20 pages. It's not a book. It's a novella. If you haven't read it, I think you should take the time to do it. It won't take you very long. It's an important piece of literature. I think that it's pretty influential, and I was not disappointed by it at all. It's about a woman who's prescribed the rest cure, which is basically just sit in a room and do nothing forever, and she loses her mind, obviously. Then we have Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke. Absolutely wish I could forget this. This is one of the most disappointing and horrible books I've ever read. It's about these two women. It's an epistolary style where they're communicating over instant messaging, and it just falls flat on everything. There's a BDSM aspect, falls flat. The queer relationship falls flat. The horror falls flat. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. Don't let anybody tell you this is a good book. Then I have Killing It by Mike Bakoven. This is the worst book that's ever been written, obviously going right into the bottom there. This book is a first draft. It is just grammar and spelling mistake after grammar and spelling mistake. Nobody edited this. It was so frustrating to read, and I hated it so much, but I could not stop reading it because of how much I hated it. It's about these people in a comedy club, and oh my god. And the guy who owns the comedy club goes crazy and he locks them in there, and it's these comedians fighting for their lives, and Mike Bakoven is not funny, and he's not smart, and he doesn't know how to write a fucking book. And this was awful. Then we have A Sunny Place for Shady People. This is Mariana Enriquez's most recent short story collection translated into English. It was exactly what I wanted. It was not as good as Our Share of Night. Just know that. They're in the same category up there. I think I enjoyed this more than The Dangers of Smoking in Bed because I was expecting her to have these stories that didn't necessarily have conclusions, and I wasn't as disappointed by just feeling confused at the end of a story. But I really hated that she had wrote this fictionalized story of Eliza Lamb, who is a real woman and not a ghost. I thought that was super disrespectful and shocking coming from a woman whose work I consider to be incredibly empathetic towards women and marginalized women and people who are shunned by society, like Eliza Lamb, who was an Asian woman with a pretty extreme mental illness. Overall, this collection left me feeling pretty unsettled, and I think it was just very well written, like all of her work. Then we have Monstrilio. I'm putting that at the top. It was one of my favorite books of all time. I knew I was going to love it. People always say that it's similar to This Thing Between Us in that it's a like kind of horror-ish book, not like traditional horror, and it's about grief. My favorite combination, done so well. There's different perspectives. It's not alternating. It's like long sort of novellas of each perspective. They don't stand alone though. And it's about this couple, and their young son dies after a lifelong illness, and after he dies, his mother cuts a piece of his lung out and feeds it and nurtures it until it grows into a little monster. It was great. It was just great. I have nothing else to say about it. It was amazing. Then we have Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. This one disappointed me. I had heard such good things about this being like a modern trans horror novel, and I thought it was really disappointing. There's a twist with one of the characters that was one of my least favorite choices I've ever read in a book. I think this book was incredibly heavy-handed, and I felt that very much on every single page. I think it's still kind of worth reading, but I certainly wouldn't read it again. There is a very interesting plot, for sure, and I think that the characterization of the two main characters is very interesting. I loved and hated them at the same time. I loved reading about them. I wanted to know what was going to happen to them. There were just choices in here that... I really didn't like. Then I read What I'd Rather Not Think About, which I am going to put into forgettable. I don't really have much to say about books in this category, obviously. This is about a woman. It's little vignettes, and her twin brother has ended his own life. And she's reminiscing on their time together and then on what her life is like in his absence. I think a story told in vignettes is just inherently forgettable. I did like how this book kind of showed the more complex relationships between siblings. Like, she's very much not perfect, and neither is he. I like that. I like someone who has died and is not like this perfect victim. Like, there was a lot of complexity there. That was well done. I'll never think about this book again. Oh my god, how many? 7 to go. I'm gonna go so fast. Then we have Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. This is going in the same category as all of her other books that I read this year, and that is that it was exactly what I wanted. I think that this is my favorite short story collection of hers. I think that they're more often than not in these stories, they had closure at the end, and I enjoyed that. It was a very good collection, and I'm surprised that it was, I think, her first collection, at least translated into English. After that is I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. That one is pretty good, but there are some issues with it. I liked it, but also kind of hated it at first, and then I saw someone else talk about it. I think it was on Carly, and she said that she enjoyed that it was something that wasn't afraid of dating itself, and when I had originally finished it, I was like, wow, this really dated itself. But then I started to appreciate it more for being okay with being of a specific time and place. It's about obsession, so obviously I love that. It follows this woman, and she's obsessed with this man who is some sort of celebrity and is kind of like stringing her along, but is more so in love with another woman who's like an Instagram influencer-ish type. And the woman, the narrator, is obsessed with both the man and this Instagram influencer. I think it was pretty real and vulnerable. I liked how it showed like the ugly sides of her and her obsession and like the ugly sides of love. I think a lot of it was like quite relatable with like just the strength of emotion and like having a fucking crush on someone and it being horrible. So I think the more I think about this book, the more I think it's good. We're almost done, I swear to God. After that, I read The Night Always Comes by Willie Vlautin. Maybe. And that one is pretty good, but there's some issues. It's about this woman who's fallen through the cracks of society, and she's trying to scrounge together enough money to purchase the house that her and her family, which is her mom and her developmentally disabled brother, live in. And she is entering like this dark underbelly of society. She does some sex work. There are some really sketchy people involved in this night of her trying to get this money together. It's very tense. It reads like a thriller, but also it can be kind of boring because a lot of this is told through dialogue, and it's very one-sided dialogue where people are just monologuing at each other, and that can be uninteresting to read. I also didn't love how this book gives you a lot of information by characters in dialogue telling each other things that the other person already knows. I thought that that was like tiring and kind of stupid. But overall, it was fine and an interesting exploration of like the American dream and the failures of that American dream. Then we have Jawbone, which is exactly what I wanted. I loved this book. I don't think it's for everyone. It is kind of a horror book. It has these very raw, real, fucked up women in it, and I know not everybody loves to read about that. This book follows the story of Fernanda and her friend, her best friend, Annalise, and Fernanda has ended up kidnapped by their English teacher and on the floor, tied up in a cabin in a place that she doesn't recognize. No spoilers there. That is truly on the back of the book. There is so much more to it than that. It's not really about the kidnapping. It's more about the history behind it, how she's come to be there. Very gross, dark, and disturbing. Exactly what I wanted. This is so metaphorical and so symbolic. I think that you could gain so much from reading it twice because it's just the whole time it's pointing you in these little directions that you don't really know until it all comes together at the end. I loved it. It was great. It was just like a very, very skillfully written book. Then we have Sorry to Disrupt the Peace by Patty Yumi Cottrell. This one I think is also exactly what I want in a book. This is about a very weird woman with one of the most detached, strange voices I've ever read, and she goes home to try to figure out why her brother has ended his life. It's so different, so good. I loved her being this character who nobody around her understands, and she actually makes everybody really uncomfortable, and she doesn't really understand that she's making everybody really uncomfortable. You're just waiting for them to say, "You're making me uncomfortable," because she does not pick up on anything. She's the weirdest character I've ever read about, and I loved reading about her, even though it could be hard to be in her head because she can be insufferable and annoying. But I thought it was a great book, and I think that it explored like a complex and nuanced representation of suicidality really well. Then we have Tender as the Flesh, which disappointed me. I don't even want to talk about it again. Everybody's been talking about how this book is so good. Everybody always tells me to read it, and I did not like it. I didn't think it was that good. I thought that it started out as interesting social commentary and then ended as just like, wouldn't this be crazy if this happened? Wouldn't it be crazy if people ate people? Also, the twist ending was just stupid and rushed, and I don't know. I really only have complaints about this book. I thought that it could be something good, and then it wasn't. Finally, the last book that I read this year, I listened to as audiobook, which I think is important for you if you read it. I am putting it in the top category, which is hard to get to right now because this is so full. That is All Fours by Miranda July. I don't know if I would have liked this as much if I had read it physically. Listening to the audiobook, Miranda July herself reads it. It is so good. You have to get into her voice. You also definitely have to listen to it on like 1.75 because she reads it so fucking slowly. But by the end of it, I just loved the way she read this book. And I loved what it explored. It's about a woman who's like middle-aged. She has a young child and she's going to go on a cross-country trip. And then she gets like half an hour outside of Los Angeles and just pulls over and stays in a motel. And she meets this man and they fall in love, and it is so incredibly erotic but not sexual at all because they both are married and they're trying not to be in love with each other. So fucking interesting throughout. I loved this book. Miranda July is so weird, so raunchy. It's just such an interesting character portrait, and the plot really kept me moving. I kept wanting to pick this up, turn it on, whatever. I loved the whole thing. I get why this was like on a lot of lists for being one of the best books of the year. I think you should listen to the audiobook version though. I really can't say much about reading it. Like truly a huge part of what I loved about this was the way she read it. And that's the end of that. I did that last bit as fast as I possibly could. I've been sitting here for 3 hours. If you can't tell, it is pitch black outside. I have to go make dinner. I am done with this. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you so much. If you want to join my Patreon, you should. Link in bio. Love you. Goodbye.